Hello. In my last video, I spoke of an attempt by the Dutch Democratic Youth to have Kodokan legalized, and to have minor attraction taught as an orientation in schools and destigmatized, so that people can move closer to ceasing this horrific violence, this conflation of minor attraction in CSA that gets innocent people killed, including those who are minors themselves. Such a conflation occurs even among those who commit or advocate for CSA. There was another group in the Netherlands, the Brotherly Love, Freedom and Diversity Party, or PNVD, which attempted to lower the age of consent to 12, lower the age of prostitution to 16, legalize real CSAM, and allow for sexual contact between humans and animals. This group was disbanded, and a man who claimed to be a pedo activist, Nelson Matman, attempted to revive it. He was later found to have possessed CSAM and was in Mexico attempting to buy an adolescent. Despite both groups claiming to advocate for pedophilia, their goals could not be further apart. The Democratic Youth sought to equip children with knowledge and empower them, including children who are pedophilic themselves, and allow people access to non-exploitative porn, while the PNVD wished to grant adults the power to exploit children and to legalize their exploitation. In this video, I will talk about why I agree with the Democratic Youth, why I oppose the PNVD, why I'm anti-contact. For a refresher, being anti-contact with regards to children means I oppose adults having sexual contact with them. Pro-Cs are those who support it. Well, it's a bit more complex than that. There are those who call themselves pro-contact, but are opposed to contact in this day and age. My friend Iris has created a spectrum of 7 stances. Number 1. Contact is ethical right now. Number 2. Contact is ethical right now if you have the approval of the parents, guardians, other adults in the youth's life, so they don't have to keep a secret, and unethical otherwise. Number 3. Contact is ethical right now if you can keep it a secret, and unethical if word of it gets out. Youth whose cases did not reach official notice are untraumatized. Youth who were noticed got indoctrinated and traumatized, hence data bias indicating supposed trauma. Number 4. Contact is unethical right now because society would most likely traumatize the youth by telling them they were abused and should be traumatized, which would make them retroactively feel traumatized. Number 5. Contact is unethical right now because of the power imbalances within an ageist society, which make youth unable to consent to significantly older individuals engage in an equal relationship. The likely trauma they experience from such relationships is real, intrinsic to, rooted in the power imbalance, not secondary. If youth were liberated from ageism, then significantly older individuals would be able to have sexual romantic relationships with youth safely and consensually and ethically. Number 6. Contact is unethical right now because of likely harm, trauma to youth intrinsic to the experience of societal ageist power imbalance in a sexual romantic relationship with a significantly older individual. Unsure if it would be ethical, unethical, likely traumatic, untraumatic, post-youth lib. Number 7. Contact is unethical right now because of likely harm, trauma to youth intrinsic to the experience of societal ageist power imbalance in a sexual romantic relationship with a significantly older individual, plus power imbalances intrinsic to certain aspects of age relationships with youth, i.e. life experience gaps, differences in neurodevelopment, and access to interpretive tools, which would render such relationships, contact, unethical even after the first factor, ageism, was dismantled. I hold position 7. Youth liberation isn't about pretending that children and adults are the exact same. That reminds me, the thing is, being anti-contact is a more rare phenomenon than one would think. The reason? Stances on contact actually have nothing to do with pedophiles. For example, spanking and circumcision are CSA, These actions are usually not performed by those who possess minor attraction, but they're performed by those who feel as though they have such power over children nonetheless. It's why most of those who commit CSA don't have minor attraction, and are often those seeking sexual gratification off an easy target, or those looking to demonstrate power over children. Whatever their reasons, or even if they possess minor attraction or not, what matters far more is that they abuse children, the most vulnerable in society. Their boundaries are routinely breached and disrespected. They are groomed and indoctrinated into believing their manipulation isn't something they should acknowledge as such or complain about, often by abusive parents and teachers. I learned this the hard way, as did so many others. But there are those who ostensibly oppose child abuse who advocate for sexual contact with them. The reason? Unlike those hateful abusers, they love children and wish nothing but the best for them. A noble sentiment, I respect it. I don't doubt many proceeds do in fact love children. The thing is, so do many abusers. Love doesn't give you a free pass for sexual contact with children, or prevent someone from abusing someone else. It doesn't make you immune to committing abuse. To assume otherwise is paternalistic. Love isn't the end-all be-all, and it's not mutually exclusive with hatred or malice, and even if it was, you can commit abuse or endangerment even with the best of intentions. There was a Dutch article that had a man talk about anecdotes from 9 youth who had relationships with adults whom the man trusted to be principled, whom the man knew they would make every effort to make the relationship as equal as possible, by allowing the children to regulate their own sexuality and lives, make the choice of when to have sex, and the freedom to leave the relationship whenever they so desire. Every single child looked back on their experiences negatively. It turns out, as equal as possible in a sexual relationship between a child and an adult is insufficient. And I hate the notion that many CSA survivors who were in such relationships only feel negatively about them because they were badgered by society to do so. You know, by the society that routinely abuses children. It really sounds a lot like abuse apologia from parents, teachers, and other adults. Meanwhile, I'm not here to make the same mistake and gaslight those who claim to have had positive experiences with adults as children. I don't deny that this is possible, or that their feelings are invalid. It's also possible to drag a child in and out of a burning building and have them come out unharmed. I maintain that the adult still committed ethical violations, that they put the child under a major risk of harm, a risk that isn't nearly as sizable to the adult because CSA is woefully underreported and often committed by those ostensibly in charge of preventing it. Which is another reason why I discourage children who wish to enter these relationships. Don't do it. Their sexual or romantic feelings are valid, and they should be allowed ways to fulfill them that don't risk their exploitation. Like dolls or something. But if they were to enter such a relationship, not only would they be subject to the aforementioned risks, but if word gets out, the child will then end up being harassed by cops, aunties, and family members, each with their own sordid history of abuse and CSA. Even when the adult is punished, the child usually still has it worse because they suffer trauma at such a young age. I don't think there's any relationship between an adult and a child where the adult suffers harm but the child doesn't. There's far too much of a difference in power, and that's what consent is all about. It's why children can consent to other children, but not to adults. Even if both the child and the adult know all the risks, there's no reliable way to prevent the risk of harm to come to a member of society's most vulnerable. Even if the risk was 10%, I'd still oppose it. The fact is, pro-contact is pro-rape. It pains me to say that because I do appreciate and sympathize with those who claim to be opposed to abuse and genuinely wish to do no harm. But good intentions are insufficient. What matters is that children are likely to be traumatized by such relationships, whether in the moment or looking back on it, or both. There have been several instances from my past where I wasn't traumatized in the moment, but I was when I had gained the interpretive tools to better understand what happened to me. Now yes, this will become much less of a problem if we do as the Netherlands tries to do, and equip children with interpretive tools early by giving them early, comprehensive sex ed, but the power imbalance is still going to be there. We should strive to minimize it as much as possible, but I don't think we're ever going to get it within acceptable bounds. I anticipate complaints that I'm being paternalistic or assimilationist, that I'm attempting to get into the good graces of those who believe that pedophiles are predisposed to commit offenses. The fact is, the status quo promotes and facilitates CSA. So much of it occurs, often by people in positions of power, so much of it goes underreported, and so much of it befalls those who are often deliberately denied the means to identify it. It's why I say that American sex ed is perhaps one of the biggest groomers of all time, and that is part of what gives rise to antis, who then often go on to commit CSA themselves. I wish to do everything possible to combat this phenomenon. That includes condemning anyone who puts children at risk of harm or trauma, even if they don't intend to inflict such a thing. The values that make me pro-para, that make me a leftist and a youth liberationist, are the same that make me anti-contact. Thus, I support the Dutch Democratic Youth and oppose the PNVD. Which reminds me, I don't specialize in animal contact discourse, but I don't think animals can consent to humans. I believe sexual contact with them puts them at severe risk of severe harm. With regards to sexual contact with corpses, if someone gives prior permission to have sex with their dead body, I don't see the problem. Maybe there's diseases or something, I don't know. I oppose it otherwise. Not my specialty. Whatever the case, there can be no freedom for oppressed people without security. This is where I had planned to originally end the video, but I decided I wanted to take a look at the cases featured in consentingjuveniles.com. After all, I feel more comfortable responding to points rather than making the first move. This site has a collection of 53 anecdotes, generally from people who feel that their sexual contact with an adult as children was free of trauma. Again, I don't deny their feelings, but I maintain that these adults committed ethical violations. You'll see a common trend here, that these adults treated these youth better than other people in their life have, which mainly serves as an indicator of how bad adultism is. You'll also see examples of what happens when children aren't taught about sex and boundaries. I'm reminded of the common corporal punishment apologia. I was spanked as a kid and I turned out alright. The first is from Adriana, as she described how two of her cousins tried to do sex acts with her when they were children, and how her Uncle Chip, who was 16, placed her hand on his penis when she was 10, once, maybe twice. She admitted she wouldn't have initiated it. Even if she enjoyed it, I'd have to ask her if she'd be willing to allow any other 10-year-old in a bed with him, breaching boundaries as he does. Of course her sex ed sucked. She claimed to not even know what an orgasm was, even at age 18. Amber, who had negligent parents, had an encounter with an 18-year-old, Terry, when she was 13. And he requested her number without asking her age. They began dating almost immediately, and she lied and told him she was 16. This eventually ended up getting them all in deep shit with CPS, which is one of the reasons I mentioned earlier why I advise against dating with that kind of age gap. You risk that kind of trauma and attention on the youth. I also advise being a more responsible parent than the mother was here. This, I'd say, is one of the examples of a troubled youth who took any step up they could to better their broken life, even if it meant entering a relationship with an adult. Another example is Bridget, the daughter of a renowned man who was head of a major corporation, who got into fights with his wife, and Bridget turned out to be a rebellious party girl as a consequence of having no private life. She involved herself in sexual experimentation with other children, who didn't know quite what they were doing because sex ed sucks. At 14, she had sex with Tony, a 19-year-old, and didn't like it. She then started dating some 27-year-old, Dave, who hit on her at a party one night, and then Ryland, some 37-year-old, as both parties cheated on each other. This 37-year-old, by the way, had a nice car, house, and business, and was thus her idea of a full-blown man. Why, he could take her to nice dinners and let her party as much as she wanted. It's another case of vulnerable people looking for resources or to form any kind of association with anyone as long as it beats their current ones. She says she was exposed to sexual things at a young age, but so were many of us. So many of us are CSA survivors, whether it be through rape or corporal punishment or circumcision. What we didn't get, whether we were surrounded by kids who wished to play doctor, or by controlling adults who wished to censor everything or pray it all away, was proper sex ed, or good parents, or a good world. Heather, here, talks about how she found solidarity with Matthew, a 23-year-old man, when she was 15. Both were CSA victims, and both were suicidal and had drug dependencies. She had him to thank for helping her get over her suicidal feelings. That's great. But the thing is, my parents gave me life. That certainly doesn't entitle them to my body. They were threatened for their relationship. The adult with statutory rape charges, which led to the youth's departure from the town, and the man's suicide. She used the more overt sexual assault she fell victim to earlier in her life as a frame of reference for what was sexually abusive, and thus she doesn't consider what the man did abusive. She says that he respected her sexual boundaries more than any other, but I say that says more about rape culture than how good this man is. She's defending an ethical violation, even if the one at risk of harm was herself. Would she condone others her age be put in that position? And again, the relationship caused her to fall victim to threats and community disdain. Now yes, the community is frequently wrong and deserve blame, but even so, the man put a vulnerable woman at risk. This story makes me sad. What a terrible world we live in, one that doesn't care for outcasts at all. This one, by Wanda, is very short. She was 14 and married an 18-year-old, Jahil? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. And had a big family. They lied about their ages on their marriage license. Insufficient data. Just try and get along, she says. That's usually suspicious advice to me. Why should you have to make an active effort to get along with who was supposed to be your lifelong partner? Clarissa, daughter to a physician of the British royal family, talked about how when she was 6 or 7 years old, she enjoyed jacking a steward off in exchange for comics. That's as fucked as it gets. I'm glad she wasn't traumatized, but she was still being exploited. Her mother told her that some things were only for grown-ups, so this piece of shit man was exploiting someone who had no idea what was going on. She calls attention to how many adults, when they find out a child is being sexually abused, victim blame and exacerbate the problem. It's a legitimate concern, but it's not the only source of trauma here. Saying so would be another form of victim blaming. Hild's case. As a 13 or 14-year-old, she was in a relationship with a man 17 years her senior. She's absolutely right that children think much more about sexual things than people realize, and that they aren't given enough privacy, and that society reacts poorly to learning you're a victim of CSA, and that people aren't tolerant enough. But I think they're too tolerant of CSA. It's not recognized nor reported enough, and the people you're supposed to be reporting to don't care either. Betty's case. This is a bit manipulative on account of the website, because what she describes as a sweet memory was playing feely with her 12 or 13-year-old brother when she was 8. Their mother believed masturbation was natural, but these kids still didn't receive proper sex ed. She knew little about contraception. Betty's childhood was fraught with boundary breachers, the adult in this case being a friend of her parents, Clark, who groped her implicitly in exchange for allowing her to drive his car. This traumatized her and affected her sexual relationships from then on, causing her to believe that sex was something she was to give in exchange for something else. She later pulled a knife on the man as he attempted to grope one of her friends. Her mother, though amused, then told her that she couldn't go around stabbing all the men who made passes at girls because it happens all the time. What a fucked up world we live in. This is exactly what I'm trying to fight here. I'm trying to fight how we're conditioned to accept sexual abuse. Jennifer, born to young, abusive parents and forced to care for younger people at a very young age and forced to do all the household chores by herself, was a victim of CSA by a drug dealer and COCSA by some teenagers. In such a cruel, alienating environment, she would take to the internet, where from ages 12 to 14, she would send dirty photos to people and encounter more predators. This culminated in her meeting one, age 34, who came from a broken background and was nicer and more sympathetic to her than the others. They met and French kissed, and he ended up driving drunk with her in his car and getting them pulled over by police, who then threatened and coerced her into lying and saying she had oral sex with him. This is really sad. It's another case of an ethical violation being seen by the victim as a step up from what they're used to. Actress Nastasia, I think, as a teenager apparently dated movie director Roman Polanski, who she claimed educated her. It's an abuse of multiple forms of power here. Linda, when she was 13, ran from home and ran into an 18-year-old man, Christopher, who got them a hotel room. They slept together and had sex, which resulted in getting her pregnant and him imprisoned. Having sex with a kid you apparently just met because you're sheltering her from her broken home life. What a world. Nikki's case is a bit unusual. She was 15 when she met the offender, Frank, who was 18. They were both still in high school. Not much of an age gap, but not quite what I'd condone yet. No one denies that the age of consent has arbitrary elements to it, but that's because there are too many relationships to analyze on a case-by-case basis. It was also nearly a year after they met when they started having sex, allegedly because everyone was doing it, and they were unaware it was a crime. At that point, they may have been 16 and 19? This caused strife between Nikki and her mother, which culminated in Nikki being brought to the police and coerced into making a statement, getting Frank arrested and put on the sex offender registry. When Nikki turned 17, she moved in with Frank and started a family with him. In Frank's case, he just so happened to be in a state where the age of consent was set to 17 instead of 16, which is a common unrestricted age of consent held by many countries, including, Marxist-Leninist fun fact, by some AES countries like the PRC, Cuba, and Vietnam, as well as Venezuela if you wish to count it. For Laos and the DPRK, it's 15. At least, according to Wikipedia. So, you know, I'm wary of them using dubious sources that make those countries look bad. So, bit of a tangent, I looked at their source for the DPRK, which cited the DPRK's criminal law, which states that those who have sex with those under 15 will be punished. If this is an attempt to make them look like some cartoon villain, it failed. Anyway, I'm not sure what to say about this case. I don't think it's so bad. It's not something I'd call pro-C. It neither helps their case nor hinders ours. This next one, which goes in a totally different direction, is from a woman who was raised in a church named Healed, who had previously suffered CSA and, when 14, lied naked with her church's leader, 65-year-old Wayne Bent, whom the church held as the Messiah. Just about every single flavor of red flag here. Wayne was convicted of several sexual charges, and Healed said he made a sacrifice to make himself look like a, quote, pedophile, so that she could meet and touch God through him. If you ask me, I don't think 65-year-old men, nor God themselves, has any business being intimate with a 14-year-old girl, no matter how gentle or tender they may be. Karen is a journalist. She opens by saying, "Children are depicted as victims, depleted of sexual urges themselves. Children seem to be innocent, read asexual, by definition. If sex was involved, the children must have been victimized. No way that they wanted any part in this. There are several errors here. Children are not depleted of sexual urges, but having them doesn't prevent them from being victims. And whether or not they wanted any part in sexual contact, they were still victims of adults being irresponsible and unethical at best. None of this is incompatible with the fact that children should absolutely be taught about this stuff. But what if a child or a youngster does have a sexual urge? What if you're 8 or 12 or 14 and you long for some kind of sexual knowledge or encounter, she asks. That's valid, and there are ways of satisfying those urges without adult contact. She goes on to talk about how she, as a 13-year-old, had sex with a 20 or 21-year-old. She admitted that he took advantage of her. The point she wanted to make here was that kids are sexual beings and that it was her decision, even if it may not have been a sound one by her own definition. I don't deny either of those. I maintain that it was on the adult to not accept her decision. The next case was a series of affairs among the cast of The Reader. The first was between Kate Winslet and who was assumed to be Stephen Tredre? I'm sorry. She was 15 and he was almost 13 years older. Another is Ray Fiennes, I actually had to look up how to pronounce his name, who apparently had a similar relationship. Insufficient data. Says he made it out alright because he's still there to talk to the interviewer. Truly some high standards. Next, Lena Olin dated a 40-year-old as a teenager. As she says, the age of consent is 15 in her country of birth, Sweden. Not what I'd consider acceptable, but she was 16 when she dated this man. 16 being, as I mentioned before, a common unrestricted age of consent in the world. Doesn't necessarily make it right, but I am more willing to accept that. I just hope she wasn't dependent on him. Finally, the movie's director, Stephen Daldry, said that he had an affair with an adult as a teenager, but spares us the details, so we have no information on this, other than how he claims to have, of course, turned out alright. The next case has a very telling title. I wasn't into it, but it felt good. That's not a good indicator of consent. The case here is an 8-year-old boy, Andy, who got into stuff with a 13-year-old girl. Okay, no adult involved, but still a significant age gap. This would be COCSA, I say. I don't really see how this helps the site's case. The next account comes from Roger Baldwin, who describes how he, at age 12 or 13, was seduced by a maid. Said he knew all there was to know already. That isn't the issue here. He was exploited by a caretaker looking for sexual gratification. The fact that, according to him, he wasn't traumatized is a matter of luck. I won't deny his feelings, but he was still subjected to unacceptable risk. This next case is a mess. This man, Bill, describes how when he was 15, he was sexually assaulted by his brother's 23 or 24-year-old wife. Kissing someone without their consent would be sexual assault no matter what age the victim was, but the fact that he was 15 made it worse. She later let him touch her, but they didn't have intercourse until he was 18 or 19. He admits she didn't know what she was doing. This case is a mess because Bill says that the affair helped his brother realize he wasn't spending enough time with his wife, thus Bill saved their marriage. What a world we live in, where someone is afforded so little time to spend with their wife that she resorts to sexual assault and youth contact. Next is P. Diddy, who, because of his Puritan upbringing, believed as a youth that masturbation was a sin, so he looked to going out to have sex with women when he was in junior high, making him easy prey. When he was 13, women took him to hotels to have sex with him. He seems proud of that. Proud of how he picked up chicks, about how he wants to smell and walk past them. The impression I'm getting is that he's a victim of rape culture for placing such a need to have sex with women he knew nothing about and seeing it as an accomplishment. He's a victim of Catholicism for denying him a healthy sexual outlet, and he's a victim of CSA not just from the women who exploited him, but also from his mother and babysitter who inflicted corporal punishment on him. It's little wonder he'd seek relief from that kind of environment. Next is Kirk Douglas, who had an affair with his English teacher when he was 14. He said he had no idea she was doing anything wrong, a testament to his poor sex education. She forced his hand on her thigh, later invited him to her home and kissed him, requesting to do more, which scared him out of the room. They remained close afterwards, and he helped take care of her until she died. He cited her as a release from life in his violent neighborhood, and an important influence in his life, something you hear over and over looking at these cases. Vili Fulau is another case of a student-teacher relationship, this time with him being 12 and his teacher being 34. He said she gave him something to live for. She was arrested for this relationship. Then after she was released, he married her when he was around 22. Would he allow other 12-year-olds to be seduced by teachers, I wonder? It's a bit sad because he criticizes the police, psychiatry, and the justice system, each of those being very valid targets for criticism. They indeed failed him here, for giving him a world in which he had nothing to live for until he was seduced and exploited. Whatever the case, if they're happy now, they're happy now. There's no longer an age or authority problem, and there's nothing I can do. He says he's not a victim. He may not be a victim of trauma, but he was one of unnecessary risk, and if that sounds paternalistic of me, I'm sorry, but it's what I believe. The next case is Ike Turner's, and it's rife with CSA. When he was a child, he was hired to clean the chicken coop of this middle-aged woman, Miss Boozy Owens. At one point, she began molesting him and teaching him sexual lessons, which involved, of course, having sex with him, which he didn't enjoy at first. This would later cause him to start having sex with his 9-year-old babysitter, keeping the money that was meant to pay her in exchange for intercourse. He was often caught by an adult woman whose solution to this conundrum was to physically and sexually abuse the young Ike via corporal punishment. Of course. His stepfather also caught him at one point and whipped him with barbed wire, then told the babysitter's mother, who proceeded to whip her too. This is the kind of fucked up situation I keep talking about, where the adults, instead of properly teaching and guiding these children, they don't tell them anything and beat the shit out of them, making the sexual exploiters look like a better alternative to them. Later, Ike was getting paid to get stuff from the store for another adult woman, Miss Reaney, in exchange for money and candy. You know the drill. She seduced him and exploited him. Without asking, of course. Adults are such bastards. Next is Aziz. He was about 10. He was seduced by a man of about 25 who lived with him and proceeded to have sex with him. He admitted that it wasn't consensual because he didn't know what was going on, and he didn't enjoy it at first. He then talks about how it isn't as taboo in Bangladesh as it is in the US, which is a misconception because CSA goes highly underreported in the US and is often committed by those tasked with preventing it. I agree with him that different people grow up at different rates and that sex ed should be more comprehensive, but hard and fast rules with regards to the unrestricted age of consent are necessary because of the amount of cases that happens. Knowledge isn't the primary thing that determines consent. Power is. Between a 10-year-old and a 25-year-old, which party is the one likely to suffer immense harm and trauma? The case of Augustin Boros pulls a bit of a trick. He was the victim of a more aggressive, more explicitly coercive form of CSA when he was 13 to 15 at the hands of a 35-year-old man. As a frame of reference for why this relationship he had with a Catholic priest when he was 14 was okay. He found this priest, Father Christopher, attractive, which isn't bad or unusual. What is very, very bad, but unfortunately not too unusual, was when Christopher followed Augustin into a bathroom and stared at his penis as he was using the urinal, masturbating at the sight. That's about as fucked as it gets. It'd be fucked up if it was any adult doing that to a child, much less a fucking Catholic priest. So because Augustin didn't have any other ways to alleviate his boredom, anger, horniness, or loneliness, he accepted a blowjob from this piece of shit. I know I ask this a lot, but would Augustin be happy with this situation had it been any other kid? If anecdotes like these are the best weapons proceeds can bring to bear against us, it's woefully insufficient. The next is the case of British politician Tom Drewberg, who had a lonely childhood with no sex ed, and thus no knowledge on how to modulate his sexual urges. He was exploited by a man at age 12 and sought to have sex with more of them, including one who accepted his advances while he had the measles, blaming himself in the event that it spread to the man and not, the man who thought it'd be okay to have sex with him. Next is Stephen Fry, who had his ass fondled by schoolmasters and had sex with an older student when he was 13 or 15. Said student may have been 18 and was in a position of authority over Stephen, who had no idea what he was going to do. The interviewer makes a mistake I wouldn't make in attempting to gaslight him into believing he was traumatized. I believe you can go through these experiences without being traumatized. I do think he needs to accept that the upperclassman was abusive and did a bad thing. Again, would he accept the upperclassman doing that to anyone else? He says he was beaten all the time at school and that he enjoyed this incident because it meant he was rendering a service to someone. Make of that what you will. Next is Hal, and it's another unusual one. He opens by talking about aunties on Twitter trying to get the government to castrate pedophiles. Bigots being bigots. He goes on to say about how he always had sexual fantasies about macho men from a young age, which isn't too unusual. What is unusual with regards to this case compared to the others is that he was 17 when he entered a relationship with a 27-year-old man. Not unacceptable, I say. When he was 18, he met a man of 42 who he married and was together with since. This isn't a Pro-C case. Well, except he said he had sex with older boys when he was 15. I don't know how much older they were. He wraps this up by saying he objects to punishing pedophiles. I agree, but one, I don't conflate them with child molesters, and two, he didn't have any pedophilic relationships unless he still looked like a prepubescent child at 17, which still wouldn't be a bad thing because that's just appearance. He says not all sexual relationships between minors and adults are abusive. There's a difference between a 14-year-old dating an adult and a 17-year-old doing so. And even if not all cases of the former are abusive, the risk is there and it disproportionately affects the younger party. Gus Harms here claimed to have had consensual sex with a doctor when he was 9 years old. He cites the fact that where he grew up, there wasn't a taboo on nudity, which is good. He complains, though, that people are paternalistic, that they assume that children don't want to have sex, and that they can decide for themselves whether or not they want to have sex with an adult. That's not the issue here. It's about power. And power is also the issue in the next case, where Guy Hawkingham slept with his teacher of around 40, Renee Schreier, when he was 16. According to Guy, Schreier taught him sex ed and politics, and helped him out of being naive. That he owes more to him than he could say. Sounds like a very imbalanced relationship to me. The next case is Hong's. He talked about how he had oral sex with a 20-year-old man as a youth, which he said was enjoyable, and how when he was 14 he found his uncle attractive and began touching him. Instead of teaching him how to better modulate his feelings, his uncle proceeded to exploit him, letting his nephew touch him. This went on until the uncle tried to have anal sex with him, which Hong rejected and stopped visiting him. A case of two men exploiting a youth's libido for their sexual pleasure. This next case gives an early red flag. Jason here talks about how there was no abuse in his family, only to then talk about how he was the victim of one of his father's tantrums. He talked about how when he was 14, a gnat flew in his eye and a man took him to a restroom to help him get it out, only to then suddenly kiss him on the mouth. What is it with these cases and glorifying sudden, unwarned sexual behavior? When he was 15, he met a man, Rob, who proceeded to have sex with him that day. They continued to meet up until Jason's mother found out, and thus Rob fled the state. Jason's totally not abusive dad came and got Jason to go to a Christian summer camp and Sunday school and church, converting him to Christianity and homeschooling him until he was 17, when he reaffirmed his homosexuality and his dad punched him. He moved out and met up with Rob again after a few years. Rob was no longer sexually interested in Jason, who had grown out of his age of attraction. Another case of an abuse victim finding solace in an attractive person, treating them nice and exploiting them. Jason says he's still good with his dad. Make of that what you will, it tells me he has low standards for how he should be treated. Not that I blame him, this is beaten into all of us. Jeff's case is a bit different, because he starts talking about how when he was 13, he'd make a game out of sneaking into his 22-year-old stepfather's room and giving him oral while he was drunk and asleep. I don't necessarily just fault the adult here. I fault the adults in Jeff's life in general for not teaching him why this would be a horrible thing to do. He then talked about having sex with and dating a 20-year-old when he was 16. I don't know if they had sex the day they met or not, the wording is ambiguous here, but I'd really have no problem otherwise. The next is an anecdote by Larry, who, when he was 15, was involved with a 23-year-old and a 28-year-old. I do have a problem here because 15 is below the age I find acceptable for adults to date, though I suppose the DPRK would be fine with it. He says two things here. One, that he thinks manipulation, hero worship, intimidation, physical force, and playing on people's insecurities are wrong, but that relationships between children and adults could work if people were more open. But that age, people are far more susceptible to those forces than they would be otherwise, no matter how open we were to each other. He says that the 23-year-old he was with was a lost child. I understand that. He was still an exploiter. Larry says he hates this culture. I do too, for reasons I'll touch on in the next case. This one. Wow. John Mitchell says he was sexually active from the age of 12. That he would follow men onto the bus, get off where they did, and ask if he could blow them, causing them to run off. He says that they don't teach you how to be a sexual predator at 12. This is the culture I hate. The one that deprives children of the tools required to modulate their sexual feelings and make them easy prey. William Percy here talks about how he had sex with a lot of adults from the ages of 14 to 17. The danger he was being put in, like someone who stares at the sun ignorant of the UV rays. Kirk Reed was 14 when things began getting sexual between him and a 19-year-old, Rich. He, of course, had family drama and was talked out of suicide by Rich on several occasions. Again, doesn't make Rich a good person, it just means Kirk's family situation was bad. Ivo Van Hove opens by admitting that there are a lot of terrible cases of age gap relationships, but says those aren't the only experiences. I never denied that. Again, I'm concerned about risk. He talks about how he had a relationship with a teacher at age 14, which is problematic on two levels, those being the age gap and the position of authority. Then there's Gjalt van Omen, who had a relationship with a man of 35 when he was 15. The man accepted his advances. Gjalt went on to complain about the hysteria regarding pedophilia. I agree with him. The hysteria regarding the pattern of attraction is asinine. CSA, on the other hand, is underreported. The next anecdote is from Chris Brand, a researcher who apparently had controversial opinions on race and intelligence. Never a good sign. He talked about how when he was 13, some men, who were funny and above average in intelligence according to him, so what they did was apparently alright to him, paid him and fondled him. He also spoke about how he tried not to look at what they were doing. This next one from Curtis is actually a COCSA case, because he was exploited from when he was 5 or 6 to when he was 10 or 11 by someone in the same grade as him. His main problem seemed to be that he simply didn't know nearly as much about sex as the other boy did. That's fine, that's why I advocate for early comprehensive sex ed. Then, this would have been much less problematic. And it probably wouldn't have occurred because Curtis may not have wanted it. Curtis questions whether or not the experience would have been much different had it been an adult exploiting him. Whatever the case, there would have been a much more severe power imbalance, and the adult would have been more equipped to coerce or kill. This next case is a strange one. It isn't CSA at all. As a child, David Hemmings was friends with British composer Benjamin Britten. That's apparently all there was to it. He said there was no sexual activity at all. The page said that Britten was infatuated with boys, but whether that means he was attracted to them, or simply liked their company or wanted the best for them in this world, I don't know. According to David, this guy cared and provided for him and asked for nothing in return. So there's no problem here. The next case is Joe. He had relationships with two men as a child. First, it was his school's janitor, Frank, in his 50s, who would masturbate him and give him oral. Joe admitted to not even knowing what sex was. He admitted later on it felt weird and that the man may have taken advantage of him. The next, when Joe was around 15, was a man in his late 20s by the name of Stan who invited him over to his house and had sex with him the second time they met. They eventually stopped having sex as Joe got older, but they remained friends even after Stan moved away. He credits Stan for being the reason he stays out of trouble and not dead, in jail, or hooked on drugs. Instead, he had his first child at the age of 18. All the good Stan may have done for Joe doesn't change the fact that he endangered him. If there's any odd case, it'd be this next one by Joaquim Lafos, whose case is included in this website as a counterpoint to the others. Specifically to Ivo Van Hove's, the 14-year-old who had a relationship with his teacher that I covered earlier. His case starts out similar to the others, having a troubled life and an uncertain future at almost 16, with his parents who weren't there for him and a school that kicked him out. A private examiner offered to help him get his diploma, and he accepted. He began learning from this tutor, but eventually the tutor began asking Joaquin about his relationship with his girlfriend, like what the sex was like. The tutor introduced him to his libertarian friends, who proceeded to give him lessons that became more hands-on over time. The tutor heaped praise on Joaquin, told him how special he was, made him think he was better than everyone else for engaging in these lessons, thus isolating him from his peers and eventually his girlfriend. After 4 years, he broke contact with his teacher and underwent a lengthy recovery process. 3 psychotherapy sessions a week for 12 years. He directed a movie based off his experiences, Private Lessons, in which he was surprised at the teacher's reception. He said that those aged 16 to 22 were easily able to recognize the abuse, but those older tended not to see things that way and were more sympathetic towards the teacher. He criticizes Van Hove, who claims that what happened to him wasn't bad or traumatic, speculates that he was coping or rationalizing. Whatever the case, he was defending a sexual abuser. Next is the case of Martin Seligman, who at age 9 was routinely hugged and kissed by his friend Myron, a newspaper salesman, for about a year as they shared their troubles, leading to Myron's arrest. I don't know what kissing means in this context, whether it was a kiss on the head or a French or whatever, if there was even any sexual feelings. It's just some adult getting too intimate with a kid, which he really shouldn't have. The trauma Martin experienced is that no one told him that Myron was arrested or why. I suppose they didn't tell him why an adult kissing a kid was a bad thing either. Just another example of kids getting kept in the dark and getting screwed over in multiple ways for it. The next is the case of Beth Kelly, who from ages 8 to 11 was in a sexual relationship with her great-aunt, Addie, who was over 50 years her senior. Beth came from a traditional family where her parents had a stormy relationship. Addie represented a reprieve from it, a caring, unconventional role model who taught Beth how to knit while also encouraging her to climb trees. She also ended up having sex with her up until they were caught by Kelly's mother. This story makes me sad. Beth goes from loving her aunt to feeling ashamed and hating her after she was caught by her mother, to feeling regretful after Addie had died that she had left her alone, seeing now that her relationship with Addie was loving and genuine. I'm not going to tell her it wasn't, just that it was also dangerous and irresponsible. She denies being exploited. All I'll say is that it doesn't always feel that way. In fact, the less sensitive someone is to feeling exploited, the more valuable of a target one is to an exploiter. I'm also not going to deny that the rest of her family is bad. Just another case of two evils. This next case, Carol, who had sex with a man at 11 and many more adults by the time she turned 14. She credits this to having gone through puberty early and her high libido, which she says caused her to try to chase and kiss people in kindergarten and elementary school. Like someone into cars chasing them on highways, dangerous stuff. As I said, people need to be taught about sex and boundaries early. She was curious about sex, so one day she gave in to the request of a man who asked to hook up with her over and over, which the refusal to take no for an answer is a red flag in of itself. She came out of the experience without trauma, but said it wasn't great. She had since seduced several adults into having sex with her, these adults who had sex with a child without even knowing her age. What a culture we live in. The next case is Dan Savage, who I think is defending the Rind study here, which had the worst methodology ever in determining abuse and was, of course, praised by NAMBLA. He claimed to have initiated sex at 14 with a 22-year-old woman, then at 15 with a 30-year-old man without trauma, and thus says he can back up the study. Again, he misses the point. None of us are saying that you're guaranteed to suffer trauma. None of us are saying there's the exact same amount of risk of trauma comparing what you went through to a 5-year-old getting molested by their father. Both are bad enough. They're ethical violations that introduce a significant risk of harm. If I ran on and off a US freeway unharmed, I wouldn't go around telling everyone how harmless it is. This point stands in the next case with Claudia Card, who claims that it's possible to look back on child-adult sex as a happy experience. Although she says her own encounter could come off as non-sexual to an observer, insufficient data. The next is the case of Judith Levine. She was 14 and had a crush on a photographer. Nothing sexual occurred. Nothing wrong here. Scott O'Hara here, when he was 12 or 13, wanted to get laid, so he joined NAMBLA because, according to him, they were the only ones willing to acknowledge that adolescents have sex lives. I agree that too few people acknowledge that. I disagree about NAMBLA being the solution to that. And so they preyed on a horny kid. What a shame. The man from this case, David Steinberg, talks about how when he was 15 in high school, he and his 25-year-old teacher apparently crushed on each other. There was no contact between the two of them, thus no problem. He talked about some other guy who preyed on schoolgirls curious about sex, and said that his friend had a positive experience with this man. Doesn't stop him from being a predator. This guy, David Toller, yearned for sexual contact with an adult at 15, which thankfully never seemed to happen. He was influenced by a film where a widow slept with a young boy out of grief. Not my frame of reference for healthy sexual contact. The last case is of Hans van Manen, who offhandedly mentioned that he, at age 11, would try to seduce adults at the carnival to no confirmed success. Horny 11-year-olds don't surprise me. I don't advocate for suppressing their voices, just for giving them harmless outlets. Well, there you have it. Dozens of cases, and I'm still anti-contact for reasons I hope I've made clear already. The fact is, I wish there was some psychic, guaranteed way to tell if contact will result in harm in the present or future. But there isn't. And kids are oppressed enough even without getting sexually exploited. But there's another thing I should address. What do I think the unrestricted age of consent should be? This is a complex subject. My programming for when I was an auntie is screaming 18. Which is the most common unrestricted age in the world, at least according to Wikipedia. You know how that is. I don't appeal to legality though. What complicates this is that depending on factors like education or material conditions, people are going to be very different across the world and learn at different rates and have different means of protecting themselves or being protected. I wouldn't accept an AOC lower than 16 anywhere. 16 is a post-pubescent age. People are biologically adults in body and brain. I wouldn't date that low myself. I come from a country where we're largely isolated and abused by the system and given extremely poor sex education. Then again, our 18-year-olds aren't much different. I admit I'm also looking into this question with a bit of a bias. When I was 25, I had a 20-year-old friend who had romantic feelings for me, but I thought they were too young. They still had ageist and anti-programming, I guess. They have since passed away, so now I feel as though I've lost my ability to look at these kinds of things objectively. That I'm overcorrecting or something. But I also fell victim to sexual assault as I scripted this video, so make of that what you will. Again, 16 is the lowest I'll accept, for now and the future. I oppose the PNVD's past attempt to lower the Dutch AOC to 12. Which reminds me, you may be thinking, wouldn't accepting 16 as an AOC be at odds with the position I spoke of at the beginning of the video? Contact is unethical right now because of likely harm trauma to youth intrinsic to the experience of societal ageist power imbalance in a sexual romantic relationship with a significantly older individual, plus power imbalances intrinsic to certain aspect of age relations with youth, i.e. life experience gaps, differences in neurodevelopment, and access to interpretive tools, which would render such relationships contact unethical even after the first factor, ageism, was dismantled. I say it isn't at odds. The aforementioned differences in neurodevelopment and body development for defensive purposes is key here. The difference between someone who is prepubescent and postpubescent. Again, I'm not here to pretend that youth and adults are the same or have the same capabilities. Adults in this context meaning postpubescent. I think that no matter how much progress is made with regards to youth liberation, there will always be fundamental differences between youth and adults that make contact an unnecessary risk to the youth. Which is why I support the Dutch Democratic Youth and Dutch Sex Ed in informing youth of such a risk and arming them in the form of knowledge and recognition of danger. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again soon. Take care.